Welcome. Come in, close the door, get comfortable, and listen closely. Have you ever paused to look at your life, taken a deep breath, and asked yourself, is this really all there is? Or is there something more, something your soul is screaming to experience, while your body keeps pretending not to hear? Since we were children, we were taught to adapt, to meet expectations, to follow the current. But what happens when following the current begins to drown you? What happens when every passing day feels like a loop without meaning, like you're living inside a script someone else wrote and you never even signed? Maybe what you're looking for isn't out there. It's not in what others have. It's not in what they say you should become. It's inside of you, waiting to be uncovered. Because this isn't an ordinary story. I won't promise you an easy journey or a happy ending that fits everyone. What I promise is an inner revolution, a real transformation that doesn't come with external rewards, but with something far more sacred, the freedom to become the person you've always known you were meant to be. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Everything vibrates before it has a name. You love the street and its colors, even if you pretend not to. Even if you hide your fascination with that chaos that smells of bread and smoke, of seasonal fruit, of children who never finish their sentences and vendors who repeat theirs like mantras of survival. You love that unplanned disorder, that rhythm with no algorithm, that doesn't ask how you're doing. It just sweeps you along, pulls you in, soaks you, exposes you without apology or explanation. It reminds you you're alive without needing a meditation to prove it. In a corner of the world where few ever look, something happened that is worth remembering. Ernesto hadn't believed in anything for years. Not in the mantras flooding social media, not in the promises of politicians, not even in the idea that everything happens for a reason. He only believed in lukewarm coffee at 3 a.m, and in that mysterious moment when the silence in the hallway seemed to whisper that, despite everything, he still wasn't dead inside. He used to say his job was to accompany people as they got off the train. He said it with irony, like someone unwilling to admit how deeply that phrase actually hurt. One ordinary night, he was assigned to the room of a man named Pedro, 84 years old, heart failure, no registered family, no visitors in the past 4 months. When Ernesto entered, he found him awake, staring at the ceiling as if seeing it for the last time, or the first. Pedro said plainly, "I can't remember my daughter's name, but I remember how my wife's hair smelled the day we met. What a stupid thing, right?" Ernesto didn't answer. He simply adjusted the pillow. Pedro added, "No need to say anything. I've already heard everything I didn't need to hear." Over the next few nights, Pedro didn't say much, but now and then he would let out a sentence as if it had slipped from some hidden corner of his soul. I wasted more time waiting for applause than for hugs. I kept so much in that I ran out of space for myself. What hurt most about aging wasn't the years. It was realizing I was no longer needed by anyone. Ernesto listened in silence, though inside those words pierced something he thought had long turned to stone. Pedro was closer to the end, yes, but also closer to the truth, and that made him unbearably luminous. One early morning, Pedro asked Ernesto to look inside a plastic bag under his bed. It was a worn-out notebook, stained on the cover with what looked like coffee and sorrow. Pedro said, "Read me the last page. I haven't got the strength, but I don't want it to go unheard." Ernesto opened it and read softly. "If I could go back, I'd live without so many masks, without trying so hard to be liked, without silencing what made me tremble. I wish I had been uglier, clumsier, freer. Maybe then I would have at least been more myself." Pedro closed his eyes. He smiled like someone who had just said everything they needed to say in one sentence. Ernesto didn't know if he had fallen asleep or slipped away forever. He remained in the room for a while, not moving, not checking the time, not doing what he was supposed to do. He just felt that something inside him had also been released, as if that man, teetering on the edge of goodbye, had unknowingly handed him a new way to begin. That morning, when Ernesto left the hospital, he didn't go straight home. He walked through streets he'd never set foot on, without headphones, without checking his phone, just listening to how his body breathed when no one rushed it. He bought buttered bread at a small kiosk that smelled like another era. He smiled at a child who looked at him without fear. And for the first time in years, he felt that life, even without promises, could be something more than a long queue with holidays. There are places that teach you more than all the books you promised to read once you were ready. Places where time isn't measured in hours but in oxygen, where each second has an invisible cost, and every small gesture could be the final line of a story no one wrote in time. That place, for Ernesto, was the night shift at his job as a palliative care nurse in a hospital with no poetry or heroism. The walls smelled of disinfectant with history, and the beds were final stations for people who were no longer there for pretty words, advice, or last-minute miracles. There, the future didn't matter. What mattered was the exact gesture that could make the present a little more dignified. A glass of water that doesn't spill, a bedsheet that doesn't scratch, a glance that doesn't wound. At some point, you tried to build your life without all that, with clean walls, no dust on your shoes, and no noise on the corners. You thought peace meant silence, that light had to be white, that harmony meant order, and you lasted about as long as a flower on a highway, because something in you was craving the street, not out of nostalgia, but because there, amid what isn't cleaned up and what isn't silenced, is where you learn the essential. The first time you cried, it wasn't for love. It was because you didn't understand a school assignment and your mother didn't know how to help. She told you to be strong, and instead of comfort, you learned to hold it in. But that night, when you stepped into the yard and heard the neighbor singing while washing his car, you understood something no adult had ever told you, that life goes on even when you don't know the answer. That was your first glimpse of utopia, and you had forgotten it like everyone forgets the sacred, believing it lives in temples when it really lives in puddles, in unrecorded laughter, in the art that was never sold, in the woman who still sells empanadas in the plaza while quoting some poet without knowing he was one. You love the street and its colors because the street doesn't try to shine, it simply glows. What we call real life today is often nothing more than a chain of soulless copies, repeated paths like misprinted receipts. But some, amid the concrete and the rules, chose to build their own inner city, not from privilege but from the sheer need to stay alive inside. Utopia is not a perfect country or an improbable future. It's not an unreachable dream or a decorative fantasy. It's not a place, it's a direction. It's that inner point you begin to walk toward when you finally stop running from yourself. It's the exact frequency where your life begins to resemble your soul. Utopia is everything you've secretly imagined and then crossed out as impractical. It's your real way of living before you were trained to survive. It's a way of being where beauty isn't a luxury, but a necessity, where joy isn't justified, it's breathed, where silence doesn't frighten, it accompanies, and above all, where being yourself no longer costs so much. And maybe that's why it's been so misunderstood, because choosing your utopia means renouncing your membership in the standard world. Utopia isn't achieved through sacrifice. It's activated through authenticity. It isn't pursued, it's embodied. And when it's embodied, no plan can compete with it, because a soul that has tasted its natural way of being in the world can no longer pretend to be functional. It can simulate, it can adapt, but something inside begins to tear, because utopia is not a prize, it's a calling. Vivian Mayer knew this. A nanny by day and secret photographer by night, she captured the invisible beauty of Chicago's streets without anyone knowing, leaving behind over 100,000 undeveloped negatives. Basquiat knew it, rising from sleeping on floors to painting truths the world refused to say. David Wojnarowicz turned his sick body into a living protest against indifference. Zanele Muholi did it too, portraying the dignity of forgotten voices at the margins of South Africa. None of them waited for approval. None of them fit in, but all of them turned their uniqueness into a sacred act. Each created their utopia without fanfare, without any promise of immortality, but with the fierce certainty that they didn't want to die imitating. And you, awakened soul, how much of what you do aligns with your true vibration? How much have you postponed what you actually came here to build? Maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're just tired of pretending to be someone you never wanted to be. Maybe what you need is not to be told who you are, but to reclaim the right to reinvent yourself from the wild. Luciano Pavarotti, the greatest tenor of the 20th century, confessed in an interview that for years he sang without joy. He did it well, but he did it by contract. He said it was like kissing without love. Until one night, at a charity concert in front of children who didn't even know who he was, he sang with a new tenderness. Not from technique, from love. Because for the first time, he wasn't singing to be applauded. He was singing to be of service. That night, he cried behind the curtain. He said he finally understood. His voice wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to move. And from that day on, he never sang the same way again. The dream becomes real. The utopia becomes real in those moments when you stop performing, when the act becomes a prayer, when talent ceases to be effort and becomes a bridge. Sometimes the issue isn't that we're doing the wrong thing. It's that we're doing it for reasons that no longer reflect us. And a small shift in perspective, a slight variation in meaning can turn the ordinary into the sacred. Because living without a mask doesn't mean abandoning what you do. It means remembering where you do it from. And when that origin shifts, everything aligns. The body, the voice, the decision, the purpose. Because there is no art more powerful than the kind that is born from a soul reconciled with its own cause. There's a myth, repeated like law in self-help books, that to live well you have to escape the noise, purify yourself, seek the mountain, meditate in silence, eat clean, think positive, forget the past. And while all that may sound lovely, there's something misleading about that story. Because if your utopia depends on erasing who you were, then it's not yours, it's borrowed. It's just another cage, draped in linen curtains. True utopia is not a place you reach. It's a rhythm you remember. And that rhythm lives in the street. It lives in the old man playing chess without a clock, in the girl dancing alone with headphones long out of battery, in the mother who yells at her son and then strokes his hair with guilty tenderness. It lives in you, even if you don't say it, even if they convinced you that who you are wasn't enough. This isn't a glorification of poverty or of chaos for the sake of chaos. This is a defense of the raw, unfiltered human, of the life lived without an audience, because that's where your true independence begins, not when everything is under control, but when you stop asking for permission to be who you really are. You remember that man on public transport, the one who always gets on with a speaker and a strange message. Sometimes he preaches, sometimes he sings, sometimes he just repeats the same story like someone is waiting to hear it at some stop. No one really looks at him. Everyone judges him. But one day, you accidentally listened, and something in his voice hurt you, not because of what he said, but because you saw yourself in him. Someone who also repeats things, hoping someone understands. That is your utopia, not a White House with organic coffee. It's that moment when you recognize your soul in someone who doesn't fit in but keeps walking, keeps creating, keeps speaking, whether or not anyone claps, whether or not anyone signs off on it. Because some truths don't need validation, they just need space to exist. And that's where it all begins. Not when you have answers, but when you stop pretending to have the right questions. When you no longer put on a mask for the interview, or for the first date, or for social media. When you surrender to the glorious fact that life is not a promise, it's an experiment, and so are you. You love the street and its colors, though you don't say it out loud because it doesn't fit your new spiritual circle, but you feel it, you know it, you need it. Because if there's something you've always known, even if you forgot it for a while, it's that your soul didn't come here to float. It came to walk, with mud, with rhythm, with scent, with music, with memory. And that, exactly that, is what will change everything. At 43, Santiago believed his life was acceptably fine, just enough not to complain out loud, but not enough to stop fantasizing about disappearing now and then. He had a remote job he quietly despised, a functional relationship where they no longer touched, a dog with a spiritual name that barked every time he meditated, and a plant that ignored him as much as he ignored himself. But Santiago had a secret, an internal contradiction that kept him awake beyond insomnia. He was fascinated by watching people on the street, not to judge them, but because he felt everyone was living more than he was. He would sit at a local cafe with coffee he didn't like and pretend to read a book he didn't understand, just to watch life go by. His favorite was a woman who passed by every Tuesday at 9:25. She wore a long skirt and a bag with drawings of planets. Sometimes she spoke to herself. Sometimes she cried while laughing. He called her the astronaut. He had never spoken to her, but he had invented 3 entire biographies for her, complete with a difficult childhood, a passion for dance, and a son living in Finland. The astronaut, without knowing it, was his weekly dose of utopia. One Thursday, he signed up for a creative writing workshop, something he had long avoided for fear someone might ask him what he truly felt. The room smelled of incense, desperation, or both. The instructor asked them to write a story about the place where your will to live resides. Santiago wrote about the astronaut, without saying it was him who watched her, without explaining why he needed her. While reading his piece aloud, his voice cracked in the 3rd line, not from emotion, but because he suddenly felt ridiculous, exposed, naked like a poorly dressed thought. When he finished, a girl in the back looked at him and said she really liked it. Then she asked if the astronaut was real, and Santiago, in the most honest impulse of his life, said yes and added something he hadn't planned. And I have no idea how to tell her that she saved me. That's when the instructor, in a fatherly tone, told him that maybe the true act of writing is daring to speak to the one who silently lives inside you. 2 days later, Santiago waited for the astronaut on the corner, with a flower in one hand and his dignity stuffed into his pocket. He had no idea what he would say. He just knew he had to break the distance. When she appeared, his hands trembled. He walked toward her, but just as he approached, a motorcycle passed too close and nudged him slightly. The flower fell to the ground. The astronaut stopped, looked at him with the saddest eyes in the world, and asked, "Are you okay?" He nodded, crouching to pick up the crushed flower. "I was going to give you this," he said without lifting his eyes, "because I made you up by accident, and now I don't know what to do with what I feel." She laughed, not a mocking laugh, but a real one, like someone who understands something they can't explain. She told him her name was Mariana, that she'd noticed him 2 months ago, and that she had even given him a mental nickname, the Motionless Reader. She found it funny that 2 strangers could end up saving each other without meaning to. They sat on a bench and talked for 3 hours. They shared silences. There were no kisses, no promises, just the certainty that something invisible had been said without words. As they said goodbye, she told him, "I used to make up stories about you too, but I never imagined one of them could be true." Santiago smiled, not because the story ended like in a movie, but because he had finally lived something that didn't need to be told to be meaningful. That night, he returned home and, for the first time, didn't open the book he didn't care about. He didn't turn on the screen to fake productivity. He poured himself a wine he didn't understand and laughed at his dog, who barked at him as if he were someone else, and he was. He was a little. The following week, he didn't see Mariana, but he didn't wait for her either. He understood that his utopia wasn't her. It was the part of himself that dared to reach for the impossible, even for an instant. That his life wasn't a tragedy. It was a script he could still rewrite. And that watching the street wasn't an escape. It was a way to remember that life is always happening out there. But it begins within. There's an elegant trap hiding in many lives. Not a big mistake. Not a spectacular fall. Something subtler, more invisible. It's the quiet habit of living halfway and calling it stability. It's swallowing your rage and naming it maturity. It's burying your longing and justifying it with responsibility. It's that routine, carefully decorated with phrases like, "I'm fine," "can't complain," "it is what it is." And behind each one of those lies a soul trembling in silence, waiting for the tiniest gesture to bring back its permission to be. What happened with Ernesto and Pedro wasn't a miracle. It was a crack, a luminous fracture in the wall of the everyday, a scene that, if you're not awake, you miss entirely. But when you see it with the eyes of the soul, it becomes a symbol that sometimes it takes someone who has nothing left to lose to say what no one dared to say when you still had everything to live for. Because the one who expects nothing can speak without filters, without costumes, without fear of being liked. And that is as close to truth as we'll ever get. We spend our lives trying to be useful, productive, likable, efficient, flawless, lovable, stable. And in that silent marathon, we forget we didn't come here to fit in. We came to live, to inhabit every contradiction, to make mistakes with artistry, to breathe without choreography, to cry in the shower without calling it weakness, to get confused and start over, to change our minds, to leave the door open and the plan unfinished. Because when the soul is allowed to speak, it doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for space. What if utopia isn't a permanent state of happiness? What if it's just a moment when you're not pretending, when you're not trying to impress anyone, when you're not thinking about mirrors or calendars? A moment when you don't want to be an example or a reference, you just want to be, to breathe, to look, to feel. A second in which you stop performing, and because of that, suddenly, you truly exist. That moment can happen in a hospital hallway, in a taxi at 4 a.m, in an argument where you finally say what you've been silencing for years, in a park where a stranger looks at you as if they've known you forever, in a song you didn't know you needed, in a phrase that slips out and somehow saves you. That's what you came for. Not to repeat what you were taught, not to be the ideal child, the perfect professional, the functional adult. You came to invent your own way of being in the world. Ernesto didn't change his life, but he changed his center of gravity, and that's all it takes. A small shift in how you see things, in how you respond, in how you walk the same corridor, but this time with your soul fully present. It's not about doing something new. It's about inhabiting the old with an awakened awareness. Maybe that's why you feel what you feel. That kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can fix. That vague discomfort that no vacation can cure. That quiet sense of putting yourself off without knowing why. It's not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a calling, a signal, a whisper from the soul saying, it's time. Time to stop acting for others. Time to pull the script from your pocket and tear it up. Time to stop having all the answers. Time to ask questions without shame. Time to stop fearing the not yet known version of yourself. Because the only way to find out who you are is to stop clinging to what no longer resonates with your truth. It's not about rebelling against everything. It's about starting to say no to what no longer gives you life. To that version of yourself that plays nice, stays silent, justifies everything. It's about remembering that true maturity is disobeying the borrowed versions of who you are. Pedro didn't need a stage to become a teacher. He only needed to be dying and lucid. He didn't preach. He didn't advise. He just said what was left, and that was enough to plant a light in someone else. Maybe that's the deepest meaning of existence, not to leave a legacy, but to touch a single consciousness and then disappear. Not to impact the world, but to awaken someone, even if just once. And you, reading or listening to this, you're not looking for a formula. You're looking for a mirror. And if this text becomes that, if it allows you to see yourself without the mask, even for a little while, then it's already doing what it was meant to do. Because we didn't come here to be read. We came to be recognized. Like when you look at someone and say, I don't know why, but I feel like there's something in them that's also in me. Somewhere along the way, the culture of effort turned into a gilded cage. We were taught that the faster you run, the more you're worth. That the more you produce, the more you matter. That silence is for the failed and that slowing down is suspicious. But sometimes pausing isn't weakness. Sometimes it's resistance. Like the wise Japanese who practice Shinrin-yoku, the art of forest bathing, doing nothing but being. Or like the Bedouins who walk the desert in silence and stop not out of fatigue but out of respect for the wind. The curious thing is, the real story, the one they don't teach in textbooks or celebrate at award ceremonies, has always been written by those who knew how to wait in the shadows. Marina Abramovich meditated with stones in the desert before turning her body into silent art. Arthur Craven, a poet boxer, vanished in a Mexican port after barely publishing anything, yet wrote the theory of chaos with his fists. Lygia Clark built sensory masks with wire and cloth to show the world that healing can happen through play. Prince Rasaden, the last nomadic shaman of Tuva, sang to the throat of the universe with a voice that seemed to come from another world. None of them asked for permission. Epictetus, even as a slave, taught freedom. And Borges said paradise must look like a library. None of them fit in, but all of them left signs, like invisible symbols for those ready to rebel by creating, for those unafraid to dance barefoot on the crust of their own habits. And you, how much of your life are you living through someone else's voice? How many decisions have you made from fear of judgment rather than desire? How many Sundays do you spend crafting the perfect image for a Monday you don't want to repeat? There's an emotional epidemic no pill can treat, living for applause, that constant craving for validation, that addiction to being admired for something you didn't even choose to be. That's not self-love. That's hunger disguised as achievement. The good news is, you can learn to live again, like in Italian neo-realist cinema, where what mattered wasn't the budget but the truth in someone's eyes. Like Billie Holiday's voice, imperfect in technique but powerful enough to make even the numb remember how it feels to feel. Like Clarice Lispector's words, which didn't tell a story but left your soul undone. What matters can't be memorized. It must be recognized, and your utopia doesn't need a business plan. It needs a crack where the light can come in. A crack like the one in your laughter when it escapes without permission. Like the one your body leaves behind when it finally dares to say, enough. Like the one that opens in your routines when you realize that nothing you're doing actually resonates with who you are. A good life isn't the one that looks perfect in photos. It's the one that doesn't need a filter to feel real. It's the one that breathes, even when no one is watching. You don't need to renounce the world. You need to reconcile with it, to walk your neighborhood again like it's a brand new film, to look at your mother again like she's a character in a Garcia Marquez novel, to reread your teenage years with the tenderness of someone embracing their wild self. Because while you were taught to correct yourself, true growth doesn't come from judgment. It comes from love. And this is where psychology meets poetry. The act of loving yourself doesn't happen in front of a mirror. It happens when you see yourself reflected in someone else and choose not to look away. When someone returns your gaze holding your whole story inside, and you don't lower your eyes, The deepest healing isn't the one that explains your wounds. It's the one that gives you permission to keep living without needing to heal them all first. There are those who find their utopia in a quiet cafe. Others on a street corner where the wind seems to remember something. Some find it in a pottery workshop where no one interrupts them. And many, so many, find it only when they dare to create a new habit. Not to change their lives, but to start feeling them. Like someone who lights a candle every night just to see what part of themselves it illuminates. Like someone who decides to walk without music, just to listen to the thoughts they've been avoiding. Because in the end, what we truly want is not to change everything. What we want is to live something worth remembering, not for others, for ourselves, something that makes us close our eyes and say, yes, that was living. And for that, we need less strategy and more soul. That's why we're writing this book, to remind you that you can stop, breathe, reset without losing yourself, that you can let go of the character without becoming uninteresting, that you can stop pretending to know everything and still walk with dignity. This is not about giving up your world. It's about becoming its conscious creator. As Pessoa once said, there's no nostalgia more painful than longing for what never existed. This book is a map to help you create it, not as they told you, but as you feel it, because your utopia will not look like anyone else's. It doesn't have to look happy. It only has to feel real to you. It doesn't matter if you don't yet know what your utopia looks like. No one does at first. Sometimes it shows up as a tremble, as a tiredness you can't explain, as a laugh that escapes in the middle of a funeral, as an absurd idea that wakes you up in the middle of the night, or as a memory you didn't know you had lost, but when it returns, it makes you cry without warning. Your utopia has no fixed shape. One day it might look like a house with a garden, another like an old bicycle, another like a shared silence with someone who demands nothing from you, and another simply like the ability to stare at the ceiling without feeling guilty. That is freedom, the absence of shame for existing as you are. Forget everything they told you about success, about happiness, about spirituality. Life is not a straight line or a race. It's a collection of moments in which you were truly present. The voice of someone you love, the smell of coffee that reminded you of your childhood, the hug from someone who had nothing to say but stayed anyway, the tears you didn't have to explain, the song that played just when you needed it. That's where your utopia begins, not in the extraordinary, but in what brings you back to yourself. You don't need a spectacular life. You need a life that's yours, one you can inhabit without disguise, without emotional makeup, without having to justify your existence every day. And that, simple as it may sound, is the most revolutionary act of all. The people who change the world are not always the most prepared. They are the ones who can no longer stand to live asleep, the ones who can't endure one more soulless meeting, one more hollow compliment, one more night on autopilot. And then they do something, anything. They write, they scream, they cook, they paint, they dance alone in the kitchen, they cry in public, they take a different route, they turn off their phone, they write to someone who wasn't expecting it, or they simply dare to be honest, even if their voice trembles. That is the true beginning. Chapter 2. Coming back to yourself, the most radical act of our time. In a corner of the world where few dare to look, something happened that's worth remembering. A man named Matteo woke up at 6 with a sleeping body and an insomniac soul. He didn't get out of bed. He dragged himself into the routine. He turned on the coffee machine with the same hand he had used to turn off his dreams 10 years earlier. Life didn't hurt him, and that was the saddest part. It didn't hurt because it didn't touch anything. He didn't love, didn't lose, didn't win. He just held on to his job, his relationship, his furniture, his past. He preserved everything, as if believing that clinging to what he had was more valuable than discovering what he truly desired. That day, by mistake or fate, Mateo forgot to activate autopilot. And in the middle of traffic, he felt. Not something huge, not an epiphany, just a small sting, the certainty that he was wasting his life trying to seem stable. For the first time in years, he didn't want to reach his destination. He wanted to get off early, walk without a purpose, sit on a bench without looking at the time. He remembered that he used to write poems, that he once believed the world needed honest madmen more than well-adjusted cynics. He remembered how, at 8 years old, he'd said he would live in a forest and write stories, and that happiness was a tree, not a bank account. But something happened, something with no name but clear symptoms, goals that weren't his, decisions shaped by fear, conversations filled with smiles and empty of truth. This isn't about quitting everything and living like a monk. It's about realizing what you've already abandoned without noticing. When was the last time you felt joy without guilt, or silence without anxiety, or desire without explaining it? What we call adulthood is often just a collection of broken promises to the child we once were. We swore we'd live differently, that we wouldn't settle, that if we ever had a stable life, we'd fill it with art, with laughter, with things that had soul. But stability arrived with an emotional expiration date, and when it came, we realized we had traded freedom for comfort. The utopia we're about to rebuild doesn't look like a social media speech or a guru telling you to leap without a parachute. It's not a battle cry. It's a whisper returning. It's the seed that didn't quite die. It's that breath you let out when no one sees you, when no one expects anything from you, when you can simply be. Your utopia is not a goal, it's a state, and it begins the day you stop pretending you're okay. When you stop repeating, it's not a big deal, I should be grateful, it'll pass, everyone goes through this. Because what's happening to you isn't sadness, it's numbness, and no one ever taught you how to turn yourself back on. Life won't hand you a map, but it will return the desire to search, not in a rush, not in desperation, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who knows there's nowhere to arrive, only something to feel again. And when that happens, when you start feeling uncomfortable in the place you once called home, you'll know transformation has begun. The real kind, the one without a name or a manual, the one that unfolds in a gesture, in a moment, in awareness. Because utopia isn't built with 5-year plans. It's built with a small decision made from the soul, like looking up at the sky on a Monday and saying, I won't rush today, like canceling a meeting you never wanted, like hearing a song and crying without needing a reason, like opening a window you hadn't looked through in years. It's not magical, it's deeper, because it's true. And the truth doesn't need to be spectacular, it only needs to be felt. This chapter isn't here to save you. It's here to remind you that you already know how to begin, and that there's no act more radical than saying, this no longer serves me, even if it still works for others, even if it's still socially acceptable, even if you don't yet have the perfect replacement. Your soul doesn't need a replacement, it needs air. And today, brother, sister of light, is the day you open the windows of your inner home, even if you're not sure whether it's raining outside. I'm here, ready to continue with the next message. Utopia is breathing, and you're beginning to feel it. No one suspects that you're coming back to yourself, that you don't laugh wholeheartedly, but you no longer fake it either. That there's a new voice inside, not loud but unwilling to be silenced. That while everyone thinks you're the same, you've already left many places internally. You're crossing a threshold without changing cities. You've let go of certainties but started to feel intuitions, the kind you don't reason through, you just know. Like when you enter a room and something tells you, this isn't my place. Or when you hear a song you've never heard and feel like it reminds you of something you haven't lived yet. That's what happens when you stop pretending. You don't become stronger, you become more real. And what's real, at first, feels fragile, because it shakes, because it shifts, because it no longer fits in. There will be days when you'll want to return to the functional lie, to that life that didn't thrill you but spared you from conflict, to that role you had perfected so well. And that's okay. The soul, like any body, has memory, and returning to yourself means breaking a silent contract with everything you once accepted just to fit in. Don't be afraid of that. Chaos isn't the enemy of awakening. It's the echo of everything that's falling so that truth can take its place. The doubts, the silence, the mood swings, the emotional fatigue, they're not signs of failure. They're signs that you're shifting the tectonic plates of your life. No one will fully understand it. Not your partner, not your friends, not even you. Because it's not something to be understood. It's something to be walked through. Coming back to yourself isn't changing your life. It's changing your frequency. It's realizing the problem wasn't your job or your routine or Mondays. It was having disconnected your decisions from your emotions. It was acting without embodying, doing for the sake of doing, speaking out of obligation, loving out of need. And now that you've started to feel again, nothing can stay the same, even if it's invisible. Even if on the outside you're still showing up, inside you're breaking centuries of programming. You're giving yourself back permission to be, without templates, without the mask of "I'm fine," without that toxic positivity that denies pain in the name of fake peace. True peace is not a mantra or a pose. It's the ability to be with yourself without needing distraction. It's accepting that some days come without answers and still not running away. It's not needing everything to make sense to know your soul is on its way. Not everything will improve right away. In fact, many things might get worse for a bit. Not because you're failing, but because you've stopped holding up what no longer serves you. And when you stop holding it, it falls. And when it falls, it scares you, but it also sets you free. So, no one prepares you for this moment. The moment when you no longer know who you are, but you're sure you don't want to go back to who you were. That sacred limbo where no roles fit, no lines help, no pre-written phrases work. You're left with only your intuition, your silence, that new rhythm that doesn't have language yet but is already pulsing. And though it may feel like you're alone, you're accompanied by the only thing that matters, your truth, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that doesn't ask for proof, the kind that, once it arrives, won't negotiate. Some will walk away, some will come closer. You might change friends, places, habits, tastes, but you're not losing anything. You're tuning your frequency. You're no longer begging to belong. You're discovering that you don't need to fit in to be loved. You only need to be at peace with the life that feels like yours. And that life, even if you don't yet know how to build it, is already waiting for you. All it needs is that you keep going, that you don't betray yourself out of fear of losing what no longer fills you, that you don't silence yourself to be liked, that you don't hide to avoid discomfort. Because when you stop pretending, everything that's true begins to recognize you. Life, music, encounters, decisions, everything starts turning in a new direction. One where you're not chasing anything, but becoming magnetic to what aligns with you. This isn't about changing everything overnight. It's about no longer justifying what no longer resonates, about letting go without needing to understand, about walking without a map, trusting without guarantees. And there, in that apparent emptiness, creation begins, yours, the one no one else can build for you. The one made from the raw matter of your truth. And that truth, for the first time, is no longer afraid to be heard. There once was a man who spent decades trapped in his own body, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to explain that inside he was still awake. No one knew. Not his mother, who visited every week. Not the doctors who looked at him with clinical pity. Not the volunteers who spoke to him as if addressing a shadow. Until one day, someone chose to see him differently, not as a patient, but as a presence, not as a diagnosis, but as a possibility. That someone was a doctor with no ego, no laurels, no pride in knowing it all, just questions and a suspicion that maybe in those quiet bodies a spark still burned. He began to try, with gentleness, with hope, with a science laced with faith. And one day, something moved, a finger, an eyebrow, a tremor almost imperceptible, but enough to understand that someone was in there, someone alive, someone waiting for someone else to believe. What happened next was a miracle without religion. The man came back, slowly, awkwardly, but he came back. He moved his arms, stood up, spoke. He laughed. He danced. He fell in love with a nurse. He wrote her letters. He walked into the courtyard and looked up at the sky with the face of someone who had never truly seen it before. It wasn't just a return, it was a rebirth. And like all rebirths, it brought joy but also discomfort. Because while he celebrated his new life, the world around him continued to operate under the same fears, the same rules, the same schedules. And that was the most painful part. Not the illness, not the confinement. The cruelest part was realizing that after awakening, the hardest thing wasn't coming back to life. It was holding on to the light in a world designed for darkness. And little by little, the body began to shut down again. Not from a lack of love, nor neglect, nor fate, simply because the system wasn't ready for someone that alive. But something remained, something no one could extinguish, a silent certainty that it is worth waking up, even if the world doesn't change, that 1 minute of full awareness justifies years of slumber, that life is not what they tell us it is what we feel when we finally stop pretending we're okay. You who are walking that same corridor, not quite asleep but not fully awake, know what I'm talking about. You know what it's like to move among people who breathe but do not live, who get up each day like they're repeating a meaningless choreography, who answer correctly, who smile on cue, who fulfill every duty but the one they owe to themselves. You know what it's like to watch from within as if it still isn't your turn to appear, but something is shifting, a different vibration, a new gesture, a sweet discomfort, like a muscle beginning to remember. You are coming back to yourself, and you don't need to understand it with words, because this is not something you explain. It is something you go through, like that man's first blink, like the first word whispered after years of silence, like the first time you realize you've been surviving, not living. And then the true miracle happens. Not the one you see in movies, not the one that moves others to tears, but the one that transforms the way you inhabit time. From that moment on, you no longer act out of habit. You no longer speak out of protocol. You don't dress to please or stay silent to fit in. From that moment on, every decision, no matter how small, becomes an act of dignity, an invisible movement that only you can recognize, but one that brings you back to life. That is what awakening is, and it doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with loneliness, with confusion, with puzzled glances from those who don't understand why you're different now. But you know that something inside has broken, and at the same time, come into alignment. You know you can't go back to who you were, because who you were no longer fits what you feel. You know that utopia isn't a place. It's that moment when everything vibrates in the exact frequency of your truth. And even if others don't see it, even if the world carries on unchanged, you're already elsewhere. In that place where the soul breathes, where silence speaks, where even the smallest motion is a celebration, where living is no longer a chore, but a way of saying thank you with every gesture, because you woke up, and that, whether others understand it or not, changes everything. No one teaches us that emptiness is not the end, but the beginning of art. That painters don't paint from fullness, but from what hurts. That the most powerful music is born from burning silence. That great poets don't write because they know. They write because they can no longer stay silent. And that the purpose of a personal utopia is not to reach a perfect ideal, but to learn how not to betray yourself in the everyday. Like someone who gives up needing to be right just to sleep in peace. Like someone who prefers a quiet coffee alone over a party full of masks. Like someone who learns to listen to the body before it has to scream. The language we were programmed with said that moving forward meant accumulating, that love meant sacrifice, that suffering was noble. But there is another way, one where moving forward means learning to let go, where love doesn't require you to lose yourself, where suffering is not romanticized, where crying in silence can be an act of emotional revolution. The most honest psychology is not always studied. Sometimes it's lived. Sometimes it happens on a train, staring out the window with clouded eyes, unsure if you're remembering or dreaming. Sometimes it shows up in the smallest act, like refusing to reply to a message you used to answer just to avoid making someone uncomfortable. True philosophy is not written in treatises. It's lived in small decisions, in saying no, even when your voice trembles, in staying alone without needing to prove to anyone that you're okay, in responding not with perfect phrases but with open emotions. Because truth never comes in polished sentences. It comes in tremors, in pauses, in stammers, in those moments when you no longer fit in, and instead of forcing yourself, you choose to wait for yourself. There's beauty in that. The same beauty as a flower growing in a crack in the pavement. The same beauty as a woman who stops dyeing her hair because she's tired of pretending. The same beauty as a man who hugs his father without needing words. These gestures that no one celebrates, but that hold up the invisible world. The world where utopias are not ideas, but ways of breathing. And you, reading or listening to this, you already knew it. You just needed a mirror that wouldn't put makeup on you. Here it is. You may go on. No permission needed, no script, no fear. There are days when you feel like everything is wrong, and you don't know why. It's not sadness. It's not anxiety. It's not anger. It's something else. A kind of internal exile, as if suddenly the world speaks a language you no longer understand, and though you're still here, you no longer quite belong. The strange part is, it's not a mistake. It's a sign of spiritual maturity. It's the exact point where real life begins. Because if you no longer belong to what surrounds you, it means you're waking up to what lives within you. The ancient Egyptians didn't have just one word for life. They had more than 10. Each one described a different kind of existence, the life of the body, of the soul, of purpose, of legacy. They knew that living wasn't just about breathing. It was about inhabiting all your levels with presence. And if one of those levels is asleep, life falls out of balance. That's why when you feel that exile, that misalignment with what once felt normal, it's not failure. It's a call to reconnect with one of those forgotten layers. And that reconnection often hurts, because you have to let old versions of yourself die, those you invented just to survive. Listen closely. You are not broken. You are being remade. You're not falling apart. You're beginning to bloom. That's why everything feels uncomfortable. Shallow people, hollow conversations, relationships with bodies but no soul. Suddenly, you can't tolerate what you used to ignore. And it's not because you've become intolerant. It's because your frequency has sharpened. Your skin no longer tolerates the friction of falsehood. And so begins the great alchemy, the transformation that isn't announced, but changes everything. Sometimes it arrives as intuition, sometimes as chronic fatigue, sometimes as a sleepless night where, for no clear reason, you play an old song and start crying as if your soul were saying, "Thank you for remembering me." Those tears are not weakness. They are release. They are doorways opening to inner worlds you once swore you'd never visit again. Look at the art of ancient civilizations. The Greeks sculpted gods because they knew every human being holds something divine that gets buried in routine. The Mayans designed their cities aligned with the stars because they intuited that if you don't live in harmony with your inner sky, you get lost on Earth. In Japan, there is a ceremony for breaking a cup and then repairing it with gold. They call it kintsugi. The fracture is not hidden, it's exalted, because what is broken and made alive again shines brighter than what never fell. Your utopia won't be a place without pain. It will be a place where every scar is art, where every mistake becomes wisdom you can offer someone else, where failure no longer brings shame because now you know that falling is part of the method. Because the only utopia that matters isn't the one you dream, it's the one you apply to the small things, to the way you speak to yourself, to how you choose, to how you restore your dignity when the world tries to take it from you. Look at cinema. Cinema Paradiso wasn't a film about movies. It was a hymn to memory, to what's lost, to what's saved, to what still beats when everything else is gone. That's the tone of this moment. You're no longer chasing happy endings. You're craving true beginnings. You don't want more perfectly scripted stories. You want real scenes, like those in which the protagonist says nothing and yet you understand everything. Because that's how you live now, with less noise, with more pauses, with more raw beauty and fewer empty words. Your revolution no longer carries signs. It carries composure, clear eyes, a no where you used to force a yes, silence instead of explanation. A new kind of joy, the kind that makes no fuss but keeps you standing tall. You are not alone. Even if no one seems to understand this process, the truth is, many are right there too, in their own battles, in their own cracks, in their own quiet transitions. Most won't speak of it, but they're living it, and that is enough. Because utopia begins when a single human being decides to stop lying to themselves, and that one gesture, however small, has the power to shift entire civilizations. Like the exact chord that, played on an old guitar, wakes a buried symphony in another soul. Keep going. Not because there's a goal, but because you now understand that walking with yourself is better than arriving without you. Keep going, not out of duty, out of joy. Because living in truth, even when it hurts, is the one luxury that cannot be bought. And now you have it, and now you know it, and now at last you choose it. There is no map for the soul. The closest thing are the signs, small, unpredictable, unmistakable. Sometimes they come in the form of a coincidence, sometimes a phrase overheard in passing, sometimes a painting that leaves you trembling without knowing why. They are sparks, keys, lights that don't scream. They point quietly in the direction of yourself. There is a scene in The Truman Show where the protagonist, after discovering his entire life has been a set, decides to walk to the edge. He walks across the sea, faces the storm, and finally reaches a door in the painted sky. He touches that last wall, and with the calm only someone who owes nothing to anyone can have, he walks through. He doesn't know what's on the other side, but he prefers it to the comfortable lie where everything was scripted. That is exactly what happens when someone dares to live their own utopia. It is not a spectacular act. It is a quiet refusal to keep following a script that no longer resonates. Most people live without knowing they're in a script. They repeat inherited phrases, borrowed desires, edited emotions to avoid making waves. They learn to smile at the funerals of their own dreams. But there are others, a few, who one day stop performing. They don't make noise, they don't make a scene, they simply stop pretending. And then the real comes in, like water, like music, like truth that doesn't impose, it settles. That thing you're feeling, that discomfort mingled with longing, that tremble you can't tell is fear or freedom, is not confusion. It's the door, the same one Truman touched, the same one many have seen but dared not cross. Because to cross it, you must leave behind everything you never truly were. The approval, The image, the role, the poses, the emotional resume you use to justify yourself. The mask of "I'm fine." And the hardest thing to let go of, the need to be understood. Not everyone will understand what you're doing. Some will call you unstable. Others will say you've changed too much. Others will just drift away in silence. And that's okay. Not everyone is ready to walk through that door. But you are. You know it because nothing fits anymore. You know it because you can no longer tolerate half-truths. You know it because something inside you is screaming without sound. This life is not negotiable. Your utopia will not be recognized on any social media. It won't trend. It won't win awards. It will be silent, but exact. It will manifest when you choose the harder path because it brings you peace. When you say no to something you always said yes to, even if no one claps. When you sit in a park and finally feel accompanied, even though you're alone. When you stop competing. When you begin trusting your rhythms, your intuitions, your blessed strangeness. Listen, the ancient sages weren't the most eloquent, they were the most present. In Navajo tribes, healers didn't prescribe pills. They asked, "When did you stop singing? When did you stop dancing? When did you stop telling stories?" They knew the soul doesn't grow sick from too many problems. It withers from a lack of expression. And you, though you don't live in a tipi or hunt buffalo, know exactly what they meant. Because something in you stopped singing. Something in you stopped telling its story. But now, no matter your age, your background, your past, you can begin again. Sing, even off-key, create. Even if no one understands, feel, even if it hurts. Because if you don't, no one else can do it for you. And if you don't do it now, the world will be left without that frequency only you can transmit. And if you ever doubt, if you ever falter, remember this. You are lighting a flame that has no shape but carries light. One that doesn't need explanation but gives warmth. One that won't go out because you have learned to breathe from the fire. Chapter 3. The Art of Living Without a Mask. To live is not the same as to function, and yet most people spend their entire existence functioning. They wake up, get dressed, work, reply to messages, check the news, go to the gym, and do all the right things to have a good life. But deep down, they feel something is missing. It's not success. It's not love. It's connection. Real, deep connection. With themselves, with what they do, with others, with the present moment. And that can't be bought, scheduled, or faked. It can only be cultivated, but only when we stop running away. Modern philosophy has found words for this emptiness, but art knew it long before. There's a painting by Edward Hopper of a woman sitting alone on a bed, looking out the window. Nothing more. Just her, the filtered light, the waiting, the silence. That seemingly simple scene says everything. There are people who seem to have it all and still feel they don't actually inhabit their lives. Not because something is missing, but because they haven't found themselves. And it's not always about going to therapy or chasing eternal answers. Sometimes all it takes is stopping, looking, asking yourself, without fear, does the life I'm living actually represent me? Life slips away while we pile up reasons to postpone what matters. Fear dresses up as caution. Pain pretends to be independence. Sadness hides behind productivity. Then one day, someone asks how you're doing and you don't know how to answer without falling into autopilot. You're fine, of course. How could you not be? And yet, there's a crack. A tiny fracture like the kind that forms in a crystal glass that still shines, but can no longer hold what it once did. That's where it begins. That tremor, that doubt, that sense of not knowing what comes next, but knowing you can't go on as you are. Because living without a mask means stripping away the routines, breaking down the scripted phrases, no longer pretending that what hurts doesn't matter. It means making space for what's true, even if you don't yet know what it looks like. And in a time that glorifies speed, that is an act of rebellion. You don't need to leave everything behind or burn every bridge. All it takes is to begin listening to yourself without interruption. And for that, you need silence. Not the silence of turning off the world, but the silence of turning on your inner hearing. In Japan, there's a concept called mei. It has no direct translation. It's the space between two things, the meaningful emptiness between musical notes, between two gestures, between thoughts. Living with meaning means learning to inhabit that space, not always rushing to the next checkpoint, but pausing in the in-between. That space is where meaning reveals itself, where you discover that you don't need to have it all figured out to take the next step, that you don't need to know who you'll be in 5 years to make a choice today. That purpose is not an abstract concept. It's a rhythm you feel in your body when you do something that resonates with you. Life begins to make sense not when you can explain it, but when it starts to feel like your own. That's why life can't be taught with instruction manuals. All we can offer are clues, gentle lights, images that float in your consciousness, a question that pierces through the rush, a story that shakes off the mask, a whisper that says, "This way," and that way is not the same for everyone. Some find it in a conversation, others in a melody, a landscape, a poem, or a hug that says everything without words. Don't ask yourself what you should be doing with your life. Ask what makes you feel most like you. That's the only reliable compass. And sometimes, to find yourself again, all you need is to return to something you once loved and left behind. Cooking without a clock, walking without a destination, reading without looking for answers, singing even if no one's listening, talking to someone without glancing at your phone, looking at the sky with the same wonder you had as a child. Because that child never left. He just adapted to survive. And now he's waiting for you to give him his voice back. In a corner of the world where few were watching, something unforgettable happened. A woman, mother of two, 42 years old, working at a bank, suddenly stopped being able to walk. There was no accident, no visible illness. Her body just said, "Enough." Her legs wouldn't respond. They took her to doctors, neurologists, stress specialists, tests, Connecticut scans, MRIs. Nothing. Everything normal. The diagnosis was a vague phrase, acute psychosomatic blockage. In simpler terms, her body did what her soul hadn't dared to do. Years spent repeating a role that didn't fit her, holding up a marriage that numbed her, wearing a smile at work while her inner world was falling apart. She never said anything. She was the kind of person who puts up with everything, who understands everything, who postpones everything. Until her body had enough of her patience. Pain that doesn't speak becomes embodied. A soul that isn't freed shows up as a symptom. She didn't know she was on the brink of awakening. She realized it only when she had no choice but to stop. That story isn't an isolated case. It's a living parable of what millions experience in silence. Lives perfectly made up on the outside, emotionally paralyzed on the inside. The mask is not always a lie. Sometimes it's an adaptation, an armor worn for so long that you no longer remember where your skin begins. That's why living without a mask is not abandoning the world. It's remembering yourself beneath everything you built to survive. There is an idea in Tibetan medicine that says illness is the soul's attempt to start a conversation with us. It doesn't come to ruin us. It comes to redirect us. That's why it's not enough to treat the symptoms. You have to listen to the message behind the discomfort. It's no coincidence when migraines repeat just as you're about to make an important decision. It's not random when insomnia appears while you're denying your deepest desire. The body is an oracle. And when it runs out of words, it uses pain as its last language. A man admired for his unshakable humor died alone, wrapped in a silence no one knew how to see. He made everyone laugh, yet cried himself to sleep every night with no one to tell. His strong body, his sharp gaze, his brilliant wit, all part of the character, but inside there was barely a voice left, whispering in secret, "I can't hold this any longer." Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it wears the mask of success, of performance, of functionality. Jim Carrey, the actor who made the entire world laugh with impossible expressions and unforgettable lines, once came to a halt. He had everything a human being is supposed to want: fame, wealth, admiration. But he publicly declared that what freed him most wasn't applause, it was emptiness. Because only when he hit emotional rock bottom did he understand he wasn't the character. He wasn't the mask. He was something deeper he had yet to discover. And from that point on, he began speaking about consciousness, about purpose, about that exact point where you stop acting and start inhabiting yourself. He's not mentioned here for his fame, but because his story shows that awakening is not for those who fail, it's for those who can no longer bear to live in appearances. Because crossing that bridge, from the noise outside to the truth inside, is not an escape, it's a return. That bridge is unstable. At times it feels like betrayal, at others like vertigo. But if you cross it with awareness, it leads to a kind of freedom that cannot be imitated or negotiated. An inner freedom that doesn't shout, but is unmistakable. That doesn't convince, but is contagious. Truly free people are not those who move to mountaintops or preach from stages. They're the ones who've learned to say no without guilt, to cry without hiding, to love without controlling everything, to fail without destroying themselves from within. Once you cross that bridge, the world reveals itself differently. You begin to see how the system trains you to be useful, not happy. How productivity has become a soulless religion. How human connection has been replaced with comments, notifications, and hollow stimulation. And you also begin to see how, in many cases, spirituality has become just another disguise. Recycled phrases, hollow mantras, retreats that pull you away from truth instead of bringing you home. But we are not doomed to repeat that farce. We can return. And it doesn't require an epiphany. Sometimes all it takes is lighting a candle in silence and asking, what part of me am I denying for fear of losing something? Sometimes it's writing a letter you'll never send, but that says everything you couldn't say. Sometimes it's just staring at a tree for 10 minutes without doing anything else. Not to become someone spiritual, just to recover who you've always been. There is nothing more revolutionary than inhabiting the everyday with soul, cooking without rush, listening without interrupting, saying what you feel without apologizing. No longer filling your schedule to avoid the void, but sitting in front of it, inhabiting it, breathing it, hearing it. Life is deeper than it seems, but also simpler. The problem isn't complexity, it's saturation. We are saturated with information, with promises, with speed. That's why this chapter doesn't offer formulas. It offers light. It doesn't teach. It remembers. It doesn't guide. It awakens. And if right now you're feeling something, even if you can't explain it, if something inside you stirred while listening, that's all that's needed. Because when truth begins to vibrate, it doesn't go silent again, not even if you try. Not even if you're afraid. Because once the real awakens, it doesn't go back to sleep. No one can teach you how to live, but some words can wake you as if they were reminding you of something forgotten. Sometimes, you don't need new answers, just a different way of asking the questions. What meaning is there in what you do every day? What are you giving your time, your attention, your energy to? And why isn't it enough? We live in a time that has confused well-being with constant stimulation. We were taught that more is better, that speed equals success, that productivity equals worth. But the most valuable things cannot be counted. There is no algorithm that measures inner peace, no metric that defines the wholeness of a soul that has learned to be present. Francesc Torralba says one of the greatest symptoms of existential emptiness in the 21st century is the replacement of meaning with sensation. We drown out silence with noise, numb pain with urgency, distract ourselves from discomfort with fleeting pleasures. We live reactively, not reflectively, responding to the world around us without asking what's going on within us. And so, years pass without ever truly inhabiting ourselves, without ever giving space to what burns but cannot speak. Marian Rojas explains it from biology. The body reacts the same way to a real fire as it does to an idea that burns inside. Chronic stress, latent anxiety, the sense of being overwhelmed. Those things often don't come from the outside, but from what we leave unresolved within. The body doesn't distinguish between actual threat and imagined one. That's why what we don't face emotionally ends up manifesting physically. And to live without a mask means to start listening to those messages without anesthesia. One of the greatest cultural errors of our time has been making emotional health into a luxury, as if only those with free time can afford to pause, as if only those without responsibilities can rethink their lives. But the truth is, no one can live fully without doing that inner work, and those who avoid it pay the price, with disconnection, with dissatisfaction, with automatic decisions that quietly dim the soul until they no longer recognize themselves. There's a little-known story about a young man named Luca, a graphic designer, 29 years old, no visible dramas. He had a job, a partner, good health, but he had no joy, and he didn't know why. Everything in his life seemed right, yet nothing felt alive. Until one day, he found himself crying at a red light, no apparent reason, or maybe every reason finally catching up. It wasn't weakness, it was clarity. His body wasn't crying for what had happened, it was crying for everything that had never been. And that moment of tears, which seemed like a breakdown, was in fact his first act of dignity. That day, he went home, shut down his computer, canceled all plans, and sat down to write. Not a brilliant essay, not a resignation letter, just a few words for himself. The first thing that spilled onto the page was a simple, shapeless phrase, "I'm forgetting myself," and that was enough. From there, everything changed, slowly, clumsily, fearfully, but it changed. Change doesn't come through grand speeches. It comes through micro acts. A no where you once said yes, a guilt-free nap, a walk without headphones, a reconnection with your body, a blank notebook, breakfast without a screen, a hug that lasts longer than necessary, a wordless prayer, a reconnection with your name. Mario Alonso Puig expressed it in a phrase worthy of being carved into the skin. The emptiness of being cannot be filled with having. Yet, we've spent decades trying. We buy, accumulate, consume experiences as if they could silence the underlying question, who am I when no one is watching? True inner work is not about becoming someone new. It's about shedding everything you never were, the expectations, the roles, the postures, the masks. When you cleanse yourself of what isn't truly yours, what is begins to emerge. And what is almost always simpler than you expected. There are no formulas. There are frequencies. No success. There is harmony. No goals. There is meaning. Daniel Habib speaks of that moment when someone says, from the depth of their soul, "It's over." Not with anger, but with certainty. Not from denial, but from acceptance. It's over, pretending. It's over, living from the outside in. It's over, begging for approval. It's over, ignoring what the body begs for, what the soul screams for, what the story itself longs for. That "it's over" doesn't destroy. It frees. It marks the beginning of a lighter, more honest, more real life. And it's not about being perfect or having it all figured out or abandoning the world. It's about returning to yourself, giving yourself permission to feel what you feel, walking with dignity toward your own authenticity. Because that path, even if walked alone, is what brings you back to life. The philosopher José Carlos Ruiz recalls the myth of Theseus, the young man who didn't know who he was, until one day he lifted the rock his father had left as a sign. Beneath it, he found a sword and sandals, symbols of his identity, tools for his journey. He had no certainties, but he had direction, no promises, but he had courage. You too have a rock waiting to be lifted, a part of you still there, waiting for the day you have the strength to see yourself without filters. That day isn't set by the calendar, it's set by your courage. And if you're here, if you've made it this far into the book, it means that day is near. Because even if you haven't said it out loud, even if you don't know how to name it, you've already begun the journey back to yourself. And that is the greatest revolution. Because those who remember themselves become luminous, and those who become luminous light up the world without making a sound. In a quiet corner of the world where few ever look, something worth remembering happened. His name was Julian, 38 years old, a refrigeration technician, son of a retired taxi driver and a mother with chronic arthritis. He was never the brightest in school, nor the most rebellious, always somewhere in the middle, neither hero nor troublemaker. He lived in a gray city, worked more than he slept, and had an absurd dream. He wanted to be a tap dancer. Yes, tap. Those shoes with metal plates that make rhythms on the floor. He discovered it one night after fixing an air conditioner in a rehearsal studio. He heard the tapping sounds, peeked in with his overalls stained with grease, and saw a woman of indeterminate age dancing like the floor itself was an instrument. He was spellbound. He didn't ask questions, didn't applaud. He just stood there like a child watching magic. That night, he searched for videos. The next day, he searched for shoes. Within the week, he bought a pair of used tap shoes he found online. They were too big, they squeaked, they gave him blisters. But he wore them anyway. He practiced at night in the garage where he worked, laid cardboard over the cement floor to protect his knees, rehearsed in the reflection of a washing machine, filmed himself with an old phone balanced on a truck battery. He didn't tell anyone, not his mother, not his co-workers, not even his best friend. Because how do you explain that at nearly 40, you want to stop being Julian the technician and become Julian who makes noise with his feet? No one would have taken him seriously, not even he did, but he couldn't stop. 3 months later, he signed up for an amateur competition, not for the prize, but because he could no longer carry the pressure of living in secret. When his turn came, his legs trembled. He climbed the stage wearing an overly pressed shirt and a pair of pants borrowed from his neighbor because his own had oil stains. He danced the best he could. Not great, not terrible, just danced. He finished drenched in sweat, a blister bleeding on his heel. There was an awkward silence, then timid applause. In that moment, he thought he had embarrassed himself, that the ridiculous dream was over. But as he came down from the stage, a man he didn't know approached him. He didn't say, "Great job." He said, "Thank you. You reminded me that I can still do what I want." Julian didn't win the contest. He was never hired by a theater. But something shifted. From that day on, he began teaching tap dancing every Saturday afternoon at a community center, unpaid, with his old shoes, his imperfect rhythm, and his whole heart. Because he realized the dream was never to be applauded. The dream was not to die without having tried. There are people who change their lives in secret. They don't post about it, don't broadcast it, don't wrap it in pretty words. One day, they simply say, "Enough," and begin to move in the rhythm of their own desire. They're not concerned about how far they'll go. They care only about coming home to themselves. Because living without a mask isn't about switching careers. It's about no longer silencing what lives inside you. It's about allowing yourself to have a ridiculous dream and doing it anyway, without needing to justify it with success. That's the part nobody tells you. Greatness doesn't always shine. Sometimes it clatters on damp cardboard. Sometimes it bleeds in silence. Sometimes it wears the costume of stubbornness. But it always sets you free, because anyone who dares to act from a place of truth, even clumsily, is already dancing to the precise frequency of fulfillment. There's no greater motivation than the fire of someone who no longer needs permission. That fire doesn't wait for outcomes. It's fueled by coherence. It feeds on small acts that seek no recognition, but that mark a definitive before and after. That's where meaning emerges, not as a concept, but as a pulse. We didn't come here to be spectacular. We came here to be alive, to laugh at who we once were, to try, even when our soul trembles, to fail with grace, to keep going, applause or not, to defy the version of success they sold us. Because in the end, the only thing that matters is whether you can look at yourself in the mirror without needing to look away. And if you haven't danced your tap dance yet, if your dream is still tucked away like those shoes you never wear for fear of seeming foolish, then this message is for you, not to walk away from your life, but to stop walking away from yourself. No one else can do it for you. No one will fully understand. And yet, if you do it, everything around you will start to understand you. That's what it means to live without a disguise, not to shine, but to burn. Even if it's in the dark, even if no one sees, even if it's not perfect, even if you never make it, but with your feet in motion and your soul on fire. Because the only truly unforgivable thing is not failure. It's never having tried at all. Some decisions are never announced, yet they change the course of a life. They don't come with fireworks or applause, just a different kind of silence. A moment that quietly divides everything into before and after. Like when you finally choose to stop pleasing, proving, performing. Like when you whisper to yourself, for the first time with truth, I didn't come here to perform. And from that moment on, everything begins to shift, not out there, but within. Because the opposite of living isn't dying. The opposite of living is repeating. Waking up each day to play the same part in front of the same crowd without having written a single line of your own script. The world is full of people who play their roles well, but live their lives poorly. Not out of malice, out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of forgetfulness. But what this chapter wants to tell you is not a reproach. It's an invitation. Because if something in you has stirred while reading this, something in your body, your soul, your memory, your courage, then you're ready. Not to become someone new, but to come back to yourself, to that version of you who never needed embellishment to shine, who didn't owe anyone an explanation to feel worthy, who knew that life isn't a trail of milestones, but of meaning. When Charlie Chaplin received a letter from the Oscars committee apologizing for having exiled him for 20 years, he didn't respond with bitterness or pride. He said nothing. He traveled to the U.S., stepped onto that stage with more wrinkles than memories, and when the audience rose in a standing ovation, tears fell from his eyes without wiping away his smile. It wasn't sentimentality. It was emotional justice. A man who had made the whole world laugh while his own world was falling apart. An artist persecuted for thinking differently, banned for speaking without permission, forgotten for telling truths during times of disguise. And still, he returned, not for the statue, but to look into the eyes of those who had judged him and, without a word, say, I'm still here, and I still shine. That's the dignity of someone who never stopped being himself, even when it cost him everything. To live meaningfully, dear soul, is not something that can be taught. It's something you choose, something you cultivate, something you honor, like a candle that doesn't light up the entire room, but enough to keep you from stumbling. And you can be that candle. You don't need to shout. You don't need thousands to hear you. All it takes is for your way of being in the world to be an act of authenticity. All it takes is for your presence not to need explanation. And how do you do that? Here come the lights. Not the big ones, the small ones, the ones that matter, the ones that hold, the ones that transform. Wake up with intention, not urgency, even if it's just 5 minutes earlier, even if it's just to breathe. Look at yourself in the mirror without rushing. Ask yourself, who am I today if I didn't have to be anyone? Pause before answering anything you don't truly feel. Learn to say, I need to think about it, without guilt. Speak from calm, not from speed. Do useless things. Read something with no practical purpose. Listen to music without multitasking. Take aimless walks. Watch the sky, not the one on Google, the real one. The one that never paints the same shade of blue twice. Bring back one sacred ritual, writing to yourself, even if it's one sentence a day, even if it makes no sense, not to understand yourself, to remember yourself. Hug more, hug longer, the kind that repairs, the kind that asks nothing in return. Forgive what you can, not because they deserve it, but because you no longer want to carry it. And above all, take responsibility for your joy, not as pressure, but as an act of freedom. Don't wait to have it all figured out before you move. Move, and things will begin to make sense. Because meaning is not something we find in stillness. It reveals itself in motion. Jim Carrey once said the hardest character to let go of was the one he called himself. And he was right. Sometimes the greatest disguise isn't the one we wear for others. It's the one we wear to convince ourselves. But eventually, even that character grows tired. And when it does, the real begins to emerge. Not the perfect, the real, the breathing, the trembling, the beating. This work, this journey, did not come to hand you tools for building an ideal life. It came to bring you back to zero, to that place where you can begin again without having to tear everything down. Because starting over doesn't always mean leaving. Sometimes it means staying, but differently, more present, more conscious, more you. And if some part of you still hesitates, remember this: no one who dared to be authentic ever ended up regretting it. They may have lost things along the way, but they gained something that can't be traded: the peace of living without betrayal. So go on. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't postpone your fire. Don't polish your soul to please others. The path isn't out there. It's inside you, and it has already begun. Even if you don't feel it, even if you don't understand it, even if it scares you, live your dreams. And this has only been the first stop on your way back. The first conscious heartbeat. The first breath that felt different. You haven't reached the end of a book, but the threshold of a new way of being in the world. You've taken off, not to escape, but to see life with eyes that can no longer pretend they're asleep. If something in you vibrated differently, if any word decided to live in your chest, then it wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. Here in Let There Be Light, you will find more paths, more ideas, more answers. We'll meet again soon.